All right, good afternoon, class. I'm following up on my concluding remarks with regard to the institution of marriage and a few different, actually four different sort of case studies or, I guess, glimpses that hopefully show us the different yet similar nature of the institution of marriage as it has found expression in different societies during different times throughout world history. And so we'll get underway here, and I'll just click through all of these. So if there are some of you who weren't in class, you can pause and update your notes accordingly. In fact, this might work for some of you who even were in class if it was difficult to keep up with all of the commentary that I made in class today. So I won't characterize much about what we have here. We left off, I believe we made it through this slide. And the final piece, we were talking about children, which are, a different historical aspect, but oftentimes are a, close, they belong in close proximity to conversations about the institution of marriage. And childbirth, something that we maybe have come to take for granted, was actually throughout much of world history a fairly dangerous moment, both in a young child's life and in the life of the mother. One of the most likely times, one of the most difficult days of anyone's existence, particularly in the case of the mother if it's her first time giving birth. So it's partly a product. It's a product of a few different things. One, obviously, medical technology, sanitation, medical studies, scholarship, and the ability to predict dangerous circumstances and to respond to those circumstances were all much more limited, largely because the field of medicine had not evolved nearly to where it is today. But there's also some cultural explanations, too, that sort of speak to this notion of patriarchy that we've been talking about throughout much of the week. And that is that the level of medical scholarship, of course, was wanting during the European Renaissance. But it was partly wanting due to some prejudices within the field itself, and that is that women's bodies and women's health issues were not given nearly the focus or priority that men's were. There were persistent sort of prejudices or notions that the female body was a less developed version of the male body, which ought to suggest a fundamental failure to grasp some of the different medical concerns and issues that were associated with one's biological sex. And then, of course, some of the gender stereotypes that were built upon that within the field of medicine. So that's worth noting. And what's also curious, perhaps, is that midwives, as the two women here that are tending to the mother who has just given birth to a child, midwives were really the unsung heroes of the childbirth phenomenon during European Renaissance history. And perhaps not surprisingly, their efforts were often overlooked, and many of the male physicians or medical professionals of that time sort of looked down upon or had an arrogant view of midwives, even though the midwives were really instrumental and important to the birthing process. That's not to say that things didn't oftentimes go poorly. I don't have the percentages at hand, I apologize, but a surprisingly high percentage of births were complicated and resulted in a mixture of stillbirths, miscarriages, or death to the mother, and it was oftentimes the case, death to both the mother and the child. So very dangerous period of time. And here's just sort of an odd fact and an odd superstition of the time. There's some evidence to suggest that women believe that if they thought about male boys and sort of imagined and envisioned images of that, of a male child, that there'd be a greater likelihood of them, in fact, having a son as opposed to a daughter. And for all the reasons we've been discussing, there were tremendous social advantages that came with sons versus daughters. And so there you have it. Now we'll fast forward a little bit and talk about marriage more in a modern context. But even in our modern context, I want to show a couple different snapshots. So talking a little bit about marriage early on in the 20th century, and then on into the late 20th century and early 21st centuries, because it shows perhaps an appreciation for just how fast norms surrounding marriage have changed. And so if we were to go back to the early 1900s, the early 20th century, we would have been, for the most part in the United States, looking at a landscape of marriage where typically there was some dating, but dating was done largely for the purposes of finding a spouse, and what happened maybe for a 2 or 3 year period, and courtship that lasted beyond that would have been sort of socially odd, socially out of sorts. And so there were all sorts of kind of expectations that would come with the courtship process, and one would follow it rather closely, rather carefully. And it's worth noting that it seems like these courtship rituals were designed more to satisfy the society around a young romantically involved couple than to satisfy the individuals themselves, which is sort of a curious aspect of even modern day America. Also, it's worth noting that there was the practice or the practice of premarital sex was fairly limited, although it's difficult to gather really reliable data for this. We don't start to have comprehensive behavioral surveys of individuals' sexual habits or sexual practices until closer to the mid-20th century. But nonetheless, based on some using different measures, different metrics, there have been some fairly informed guesstimates that about 1 in 3 women of the early 20th century would have engaged in premarital sex. And again, it's revealing that this is revealed in terms of women and not men and women. So it speaks a little bit to the ways in which some of the double standards that were applied at that time. That premarital sex, in so much as it was scandalous, it was more scandalous toward the women than it was toward the men. But even so, in that context, most premarital sex in the early 20th century would have been monogamous, and oftentimes with the eventual person that young woman would go on to marry. This postcard is kind of an interesting phenomenon, and it was sort of a play. If you look at this postcard, the sort of message was that that there's sort of a delicate dance here where the young woman in this postcard is suggesting, if you ask me for my hand in marriage, I may very well indulge your interest in sexual activity. That's sort of the kind of subtle subtext. And there were a lot of postcards that sort of played upon this. And I only put it up here because I thought it captured sort of that topic of that a lot of premarital sex in the early 20th century was still sort of leading toward ultimate marriage. Okay? And then if we skip ahead to the 1950s, what most Americans don't realize is that a lot of even contemporary notions of the institution of marriage are traceable back to the 1950s. What most modern Americans are less aware of is that the 1950s is held up as this sort of pinnacle of traditional American sort of morals and conduct. And the reality is that the 1950s were no more representative of America as a whole than, say, the 1930s or the 1870s or the 1820s. The 1950s becomes a pivotal sort of cultural standard, I think, in large part because it's the age of TV. We have all sorts of media, advertising explosions. Those things had been around, but they become particularly evident in the 1950s. And so the images that emerge alongside the sort of mass cultivation of the American imagination are crystallized around some of the standards and ideals that were in place at that time. Nonetheless, the nuclear family becomes very common, largely because of the suburban explosion that emerges after World War II, the time of the GI Bill, the Highway Act. A lot of the ways in which our society is structured are contingent upon developments happening in the post-World War II era. And so the nuclear family, meaning a family that doesn't consist of extended, grandparents and maybe aunts and uncles, and the household becomes less about, family. The nuclear family and the household start to become one and the same, whereas the household was a little bit more extensive in many cases in the decades prior to World War II. Also in the 1950s, there's a sense that one being single is odd and sort of suggests that maybe one is something of a social outcast or a deviant in the sense that they're not sort of sticking with the typical pattern of American cultural standards. And again, that becomes the 1950s are sort of more of an outlier than they are a standard. Homosexual relationships in the mid-20th century are still regarded widely as taboo, although that will soon change in the 1960s as there essentially emerges a civil rights movement to go along with the LGBTQ community as well. And so gay marriage is about to enter into the cultural conversation and become a more powerful part of it. Other norms we'll just highlight with regards to by the 1970s, again, partly because of several things. There's the birth control pill. There's the fact that the counterculture of the 1960s, those movements for social quote-unquote progress have been taking place, environmental movement, peace movement, the civil rights movement of African Americans and others in support and advocating for civil rights for African Americans, the women's movement, so on and so forth. There's a lot going on, and in the cultural backdrop, marriage becomes marital standards, marital taboos, so on and so forth, become less. At the same time, divorce rates are going up dramatically, as you can see in this chart. And as divorce rates go up, people become a little more cautious about the institution of marriage, such that in the 1980s, we start to see an increase in cohabitation before marriage, something that had been sort of socially taboo or unacceptable before is becoming much more so in the 80s and 90s. You'll see the 1 out of 3 children are born outside of marriages. Now let me just close. I want to make sure I get these terms out here because I think I'm just about out of time, and we'll stop with this. But we start to see, of course, that